Hello and welcome. My name is Adam Martin. In today's tutorial, we're going to talk about how to create infographics using an online application called Infogram. Before we get into actually creating infographics, we're going to go ahead and analyze a little bit of data for use in our infographics. This is very often the first step in creating infographics. Data, numbers, and statistics are the back end that powers infographics. Being able to extract useful numbers and information from a large data set is a great skill for journalists to have. In this video, I will show you how that process works. In the following videos, we will use the numbers that we pull in this video to create charts, graphs, and maps. Don't worry, the student assignment at the end of this tutorial does not involve data analysis. For the assignment, all the data, numbers, and data will be given to you. We will further discuss data analysis and data reporting in future sessions of the course. We're going to start with a data set assembled by the Washington Post that looks at homicides over the United States. So as we can see, this is the GitHub page for the data repo. It says, the Washington Post collected data on more than 52,000 criminal homicides over the past decade in 50 of the largest American cities. So the data spans from 2007 to 2017, and like it says, it examines homicides in 50 of the largest American cities. The Post goes on to talk a little bit about their methodology for collecting the data and a little bit of data definitions and also their mapping methodology. From this data, the Post created some really gorgeous stories and maps, including this story called Where Killings Go Unsolved, which has a lovely presentation and lots of embedded maps. And also another story called Murder with Impunity. It's more of a data visualization, looking at a lot of the things that they found in this data set. So let's go ahead and take a look at the data. I'm going to just open it in Excel. And we can see this is our data set. So let's take a look at what we've got here. We've got a unique ID for each row. We've got a reported date, which is in kind of a weird format. We have the victim's last name and first name, the victim's race, age, and gender, the city and state where the homicide happened, and then a latitude and longitude for exact location, as well as what they call disposition, which is how the case was closed. And there's a couple options here. It can be closed by arrest, closed without arrest, or open and no arrest. So this is our data. And there's a lot we can do with this. So often the next step is to do what we call interviewing the data, where after we've kind of taken a look at the data, we will come up with a series of questions that we want to answer about this data. So here are the data questions that I came up with that we want to ask this data set. First, are homicide victims increasing or decreasing by year across cities in the United States? What do homicide victims look like? How do these numbers break down by race, gender, and age? Next, what are the top 5 cities and states for homicides in the United States? Next, how are the cases resolved? Next, what are the cities in the U.S. with the most unsolved homicides? And finally, I always like to throw in an oddball question just to see what we come up with. And in this case, we'll look at what are the top first and last names of homicide victims. Okay, so now that we have our questions, we can go into working on the data a little bit and doing a few operations that will help us answer these questions. First thing we want to do is we'll go ahead and select our top row. We'll go over to View and we'll say Freeze Top Row. And we'll go ahead and bold that as well. And that way our top row will just sort of always be there as we scroll through our data set. The next thing I want to do just really quickly is I want to deal with this date. There's kind of just a weird date format. It's hard to pull out here. Like this is actually May 4th, 2010, but it's hard to read and we can't do much with that programmatically. So I'm going to make a new field over here. And I'm going to call it, we'll just call it new in a better format. And to do that, I have a formula saved over here I can use that will just go ahead and put that date in a formula that'll be a lot more usable to us so we can see that worked. You just double click there to go ahead and copy that all the way down. We're going to look at 3 basic ways to analyze data in Excel. We're going to look at filtering, sorting, and also at pivot tables. We'll look at filtering a little bit later, but let's start out by looking at sorting, which is really quite simple. If we go over to data, we can click the sort button, and it'll allow us to sort our data based on any column. So for instance, we could look at the victim's last name and sort from A to Z, and that's going to sort the whole database based on our victim's last name. We could also sort, for instance, based on state, and maybe we want to go from Z to A, and that's going to go ahead and start sorting our states from Z to A. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and sort by the ID from top to bottom as we had it before. Okay, and the next thing that we want to look at is how to use pivot tables. Pivot tables are a really powerful function in Excel that allow us to compare and look at different elements in our data to keep an eye out for trends and outliers and different interesting things. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make a pivot table that looks at race in our data. So we will go ahead and go to Insert, Pivot Table. Just click OK, and that's going to start a new tab for our pivot table. And you'll see we have lots of options over here. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to drag victim race down into the rows. And that's going to give us a row for each race that's in our database. And finally, for value, I'm going to drag victim race down here, and it's going to give us a count of each of those races in our database. So as you can see, the biggest values in our database are black and Hispanic, then white, then unknown, then other, then Asian. So we can also pretty easily create some percentages here just by doing a quick formula that divides the part by the whole. So if we say B2 divided by B10, that's 4 divided by B10. And we need to change this whole row over to a percentage. Okay, and we can go ahead and click that down, and we'll see that 64% of the victims in our database were black, 13% Hispanic, 12% were white. Okay, so that's a really nice pivot table, and it gives us a little insight into our data. Let's go ahead and do one good thing to do is to name this tab, so we'll call it victim by race. Okay, now let's go ahead and make another pivot table. Go to Insert, Pivot Table. And let's take a look at disposition this time. All right, so we'll just go through the same operation. We'll drag disposition down into rows. And that'll show us the 3 options for disposition. And we'll just go ahead and do a count of those. And again, we can really quickly create some percentages here. Okay, and so we're seeing that about half of the homicide cases in the U.S. were closed by arrest, 6% closed without arrest, and pretty close to half remain open. Okay, so while we're on homicides, let's take a look at cities with the most unsolved homicides. So first we'll name this tab. This was disposition. All right, so we'll go back to our original data and we will insert another pivot table. And this time in the row, we want to go ahead and drag down the city. And for the value, we want the count of the city. We want to go ahead and filter by disposition. So this will allow us to select which dispositions we'd like to see in our data. And we'll go ahead and look at open, no arrest, right? So these are open homicide investigations. Okay, and this is going to give us a count of each of the cities in the database and how many open homicide investigations they have. And now we can do a little bit of sorting. So we can sort by count of city, and we want to sort descending. And then this will give us, right, the cities with the most unsolved homicides. We see Chicago, Baltimore, Detroit, Philadelphia, Houston, Los Angeles, etc. Okay, so I'm going to use pivot tables to answer all of the questions that we had here, right? Are homicide victims increasing or decreasing? What do homicide victims look like, etc.? Pivot tables are really powerful. The age question is going to be a little bit trickier because I'm going to need to group by age, but I have a pretty simple function that'll do that. There are a lot of really powerful things you can do with pivot tables, including combining values from your tables and looking at things in small detail. I'm going to go ahead and analyze the rest of the data off video, and in the next video we'll come back and look at all the worked data and go ahead and make some infographics from that. Before we do that, I want to show you one final thing in Excel, and that is filtering. So I'm going to name this tab. This was our top cities for unsolved. Okay, so go back to our original data, and now what I want to do is filter a little bit. So if we look at our top cities for unsolved homicides, we see that Chicago is at the top. So perhaps it would be useful to look at our database from the perspective of just Chicago. And Excel allows us to do that really easily using filter. So if we go back to data and we click filter, we can filter by any of our columns. And we'll go ahead and filter by city. It's going to show us all of our cities, and we'll go ahead and deselect all of them and then just select Chicago. And that's going to give us a new data set that shows just homicide incidents in Chicago. What I'm going to do is go ahead and copy and paste this entire data set into a new tab. And we will use that to do a little mapping. To do a little bit of mapping in one of the future videos.